Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today, we will uncover the dark secrets of Hollow Ridge, a place where the truth was buried along with the records that were supposed to preserve it. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. In the Appalachian Mountains, where mist clings to the slopes like a secret kept for too long, lies a valley bearing a name whispered only when necessary: Hollow Ridge, a patch of land in West Virginia that, in 1917, witnessed events so disturbing that the county archives themselves seem to have conspired to erase them from collective memory. The story we are about to explore began not with an obvious crime, but with something far more insidious: the systematic disappearance of official documents, property records, and certificates mentioning a specific man. A farmer who, according to fragmented testimonies found in personal diaries and letters preserved by chance, had committed acts that defied human comprehension. The Appalachian region has always been marked by its isolation. Entire communities lived separated from one another by miles of dense forest, connected only by narrow trails that snaked through the mountains. Hollow Ridge was no different. Located in Webster County, the area was home to scattered farms where families lived off the cultivation of tobacco and corn, the raising of pigs and chickens, and the seasonal hunting that the forests offered. Life there followed a rhythm dictated by the seasons, by the harshness of winter and the uncertain generosity of summer. People knew each other by surnames, by the lands they had occupied for generations, by agreements sealed with handshakes, and by a word that was worth more than any signed document. But in 1917, something changed. The county registry office records began to show inexplicable gaps. Pages torn out, deed books with entire blank sections as if they had never been filled in, birth and death certificates that simply no longer existed. And at the center of this documentary void, a name appeared and disappeared like smoke: Ezekiel Thornwood, the Hollow Ridge rancher, whose property stretched across more than 400 hectares of mountainous land, including a significant portion of virgin forest that no one dared to enter anymore. The few records that survived this mysterious purge reveal a man who arrived in the region around 1905, buying land with money whose origin was never publicly questioned. Thornwood wasn't from there. His speech carried an accent that some identified as coming from the Deep South, perhaps Louisiana or Mississippi, but he never confirmed nor denied it. He built his house away from the main road, atop a hill from where the entire valley could be seen. A dark wooden structure, with narrow windows that seemed to observe more than reveal. Around it, barns, sheds, and a series of smaller buildings whose exact function remained a mystery to the nearest neighbors, who nevertheless lived miles away. Thornwood kept his distance, but not entirely reclusive. He appeared in town every 2 or 3 weeks to buy provisions, sell produce, and occasionally hire temporary workers to help with the harvest or repairs. It was during these times that people could observe him. A tall man, thin as a winter twig, with clear eyes that seemed to assess everything and everyone with an uncomfortable intensity. He spoke little, paid well and in cash, and always left before conversations extended beyond what was strictly necessary. Workers who spent time on Thornwood's farm offered vague and contradictory accounts. Some said the work was hard but honest, that the farmer treated them with professional indifference and nothing more. Others, however, mentioned inexplicable sensations. The persistent smell emanating from one of the distant sheds, described as something between damp earth and rusty metal. The nighttime sounds echoing through the valley, groans that could be wind rustling through the trees or something entirely different. And then there were the rules. Thornwood established clear boundaries about where workers could move around. Certain areas of the property were strictly off-limits, and he made this very clear at the time of hiring. Anyone who transgressed would be dismissed immediately, without pay. The community of Hollow Ridge, like so many others isolated in the mountains, functioned through informal networks of information: conversations at church on Sundays, chance encounters on the road, visits between distant neighbors. It was through these networks that whispers about Thornwood began to circulate. Nothing concrete, never direct accusations, but that kind of distrust that accumulates drop by drop until it forms a deep well of unease. They said that people who worked for him changed afterward. They became quieter, more nervous. avoided talking about the experience. Some simply left the region without saying goodbye, leaving behind belongings and relationships as if fleeing something unnameable. In 1912, something happened that intensified these suspicions. A seasonal worker named Martin Dalton, who had spent nearly 6 months on the Thornwood farm, showed up at the county sheriff's house in the middle of the night. He was visibly shaken, sweating despite the October chill, and insisted on making a formal statement. The sheriff, a man named William Hargrove, took Dalton inside and listened to what he had to say. But here's the crucial point. No official record of this conversation exists. The incident book from that period was one of many documents that disappeared from the archives. What we do know comes from a letter Hargrove's wife wrote to a sister living in Ohio, preserved by pure chance in a family collection. In the letter, she mentions that her husband spent days visibly disturbed after that night, that he had gone to Thornwood's farm with 2 deputies, but returned without making any arrests or filing a formal complaint. Dalton left the region soon after, and no one heard from him again. Hargrove, when questioned by curious onlookers, only said that there was not enough evidence to proceed with any investigation. But something changed in him. Those who knew him well noticed how he began to avoid going near Hollow Ridge, how he changed conversations whenever the name Thornwood was mentioned. The following years brought an unsettling quiet. Thornwood continued his activities. The farm prospered modestly, and life in the region followed its slow and predictable course. But beneath the surface of this apparent normality, something was brewing. Workers continued to come and go, some staying only days before abruptly leaving. Stories accumulated on the fringes of the community, never solid enough to generate action, but impossible to ignore completely. There were mentions of underground constructions on the property, cellars or tunnels that Thornwood supposedly had dug, for purposes he never explained. Some claimed to have seen lights moving through the forest in strange patterns at dusk, as if someone were performing some kind of ritual or ceremony. World War I brought change even to remote places like Hollow Ridge. Men were drafted, the local economy suffered, and the attention of the authorities turned to issues bigger than the mysteries of an eccentric farmer. It was in this context, in 1917, that events finally reached a point of no return. What exactly happened that year remains shrouded in mystery, but we know it involved the arrival of an outside investigator, someone who didn't belong to the region, and who, therefore, wasn't subject to the same fears and hesitations that paralyzed the locals. This investigator, whose name appears in fragments of correspondence as Samuel Brennan, was allegedly sent by a government office related to the administration of federal lands. His official mission involved cataloging rural properties for census and taxation purposes, a bureaucratic task that led him to travel to various isolated farms throughout the Appalachians. Brennan was methodical, polite, and deeply committed to his work. He carried notebooks where he noted everything: property dimensions, land conditions, number of buildings, state of access roads. For him, each farm was just another entry in his records, another set of data to be processed and filed. When Brennan arrived at Hollow Ridge one afternoon in March, he had no reason to expect anything more than another routine inspection. Spring was beginning to awaken in the mountains, bringing with it that hesitant green that emerges before the full explosion of summer. The road to the Thornwood estate was steep and poorly maintained, forcing Brennan to leave his carriage on the main road and continue on foot for the last few miles. He noted this in his notebook, commenting on the difficulty of access and how this certainly affected the transport of farm produce to the markets. Thornwood greeted him with the cold courtesy that was his trademark. He offered water, allowed Brennan to inspect the main barns and farmland, and answered questions with economic precision. Everything seemed to be going smoothly, until Brennan, consulting his preliminary maps, noticed discrepancies between the official property boundaries and what Thornwood claimed to own. There was a significant portion of land, about 80 acres of dense forest north of the main house, that did not appear on any official purchase record or deed. When questioned about this, Thornwood became visibly uncomfortable for the first time. The explanation he offered was vague and contradictory. He spoke of verbal agreements with previous owners, of documents that had supposedly been lost in a fire at the registry office years before, of local land tenure traditions that didn't exactly follow formal legal procedures. Brennan, accustomed to dealing with similar situations in other rural areas, initially saw nothing extraordinary in this. Land in the Appalachians changed hands through methods that frequently bypassed official bureaucracy. He simply noted the discrepancy and requested that Thornwood regularize the situation when possible. But then came the request that changed everything. Brennan, following his standard protocol, expressed a desire to take a walk around the property's boundaries, including the wooded area in question. He wanted to personally verify the terrain's conditions, identify natural landmarks that could serve as reference points for future surveys. It was a reasonable request, an integral part of his job. Thornwood's reaction was immediate and intense. He categorically refused, claiming that the forest was dangerous, full of hidden ravines and wild animals, that even he rarely ventured there and certainly wouldn't allow a visitor to take the risk. The vehemence of the refusal, the almost desperate tone in Thornwood's normally controlled voice, aroused in Brennan something more than professional curiosity. The investigator decided not to press the issue at that moment. He thanked them for their hospitality, completed his notes on the areas he had inspected, and left, promising to return in a few weeks to finalize the survey. But the seed of suspicion had been planted. Brennan was a man of detail, trained to notice inconsistencies, and something about Thornwood's reaction didn't add up. During his stay at an inn in the nearest town, he began to ask discreet questions. He spoke with merchants, the blacksmith, the innkeeper, and that's how the stories began to reach him. Each person had a different story to tell, but the themes repeated themselves. Thornwood's isolation, the workers who left abruptly, the nighttime sounds, the forbidden areas of the farm, the incident with Martin Dalton years before. Brennan, a skeptic by nature, initially dismissed much of it as rural superstition and small-town gossip, but the more he investigated, the more consistency he found in the inconsistencies. There were patterns in the stories, details that repeated themselves regardless of the source, and above all, there was the palpable fear that people displayed when talking about the farmer of Hollow Ridge. The investigator decided to seek out Sheriff Hargrove. The meeting between the two was tense from the start. Hargrove clearly didn't want to discuss Thornwood, but Brennan had federal authority on his side and knew how to use it. Pressed, the sheriff finally admitted that there were suspicions, that something disturbing had been reported years earlier, but that there was no concrete evidence to justify any legal action. When Brennan inquired about the official records from that time, Hargrove became visibly uncomfortable. He said that many documents had been lost over the years, that the registry office had organizational problems, and that it wasn't uncommon for files to disappear in small, poorly funded counties. But there was something in the way Hargrove spoke, a weight to his words, a hesitation that suggested unshared knowledge. Brennan realized he was facing a man torn between duty and fear, between what he knew to be right and what he considered prudent. The sheriff ended the conversation with a veiled warning. He said that Hollow Ridge was a place where sensible people didn't meddle, that there were things in the mountains that were better left alone, that the law couldn't or shouldn't always reach every corner. It was strange advice coming from a representative of justice, and it only served to intensify Brennan's resolve. Brennan spent the following days in a silent investigation bordering on obsession. He visited the county registry office in person, requesting access to Hollow Ridge's property records. What he found was disconcerting. Missing pages from the deed books, precisely where Thornwood's records should have been. Certificates with dates that made no chronological sense. Documents referencing other non-existent documents. It was as if someone had spent years carefully erasing Ezekiel Thornwood's presence from the official files, but without managing to completely eliminate all traces. Fragments remained, oblique references, documentary shadows that suggested something much bigger than simple bureaucratic disorganization. The clerk, an elderly man named Preston Walsh, watched Brennan with growing nervousness as he leafed through the old volumes. Finally, when they were alone in the archive, Walsh approached and spoke in a low voice. He recounted that he had worked there for over 30 years, and that during that time he had witnessed strange nighttime visits, people who would show up after hours with vague authorizations, requesting access to specific records, pages that would mysteriously disappear, subtle pressure from important figures in the community to have certain documents considered lost or damaged. Walsh never had the courage to question or report it, but guilt haunted him. He knew he was complicit in something wrong, but he also knew that his own safety depended on his silence. This revelation completely transformed the nature of Brennan's investigation. He was no longer dealing with just an eccentric farmer on an isolated property. He was facing something systematic, a conspiracy of silence involving multiple levels of the community. Someone had a great deal to lose if the truth about Thornwood came to light, and that someone had worked methodically to ensure that documentary evidence was eliminated. The question that haunted Brennan was simple but terrifying. What could be so serious as to justify this deliberate effort of erasure? He decided to seek alternative sources of information: personal correspondence, diaries, local church records. He discovered that the Hollow Ridge Baptist Church kept its own books with notes on congregation members, births, marriages, and deaths. The pastor, Reverend Marcus Coldwell, was a middle-aged man with tired eyes that seemed to have seen more than they would like. Initially reluctant, he eventually allowed Brennan to consult the records after a long conversation about moral duty and the importance of truth. The church records revealed disturbing patterns. In the years since Thornwood's arrival in the region, there had been an unusual number of sudden departures. Families simply vanished from the records as if they had evaporated. Temporary workers were mentioned in one entry and never reappeared. Most unsettling was that many of these names coincided with people who, according to the stories Brennan had collected, had worked for Thornwood at some point. Reverend Coldwell examined the records with a somber expression and finally admitted that he had prayed for years that his suspicions were unfounded, but that deep down he knew something profoundly wrong was happening in those mountains. Brennan also discovered letters in a collection held by the local historical society. One of them, written by an itinerant professor in 1914, described a visit to Hollow Ridge and mentioned the feeling of unease that permeated the region. The professor wrote about conversations with residents who spoke in hushed tones about the farmer on the hill, about how people avoided looking in the direction of that property when passing by on the road, about children who were instructed never to approach those lands. There was a particularly revealing passage where the professor commented, "It's as if everyone knew a terrible secret, but no one dared to pronounce it aloud, as if the very words could invoke unbearable consequences." Armed with this growing collection of circumstantial evidence, Brennan made a decision that would define everything that came after. He would return to the Thornwood farm, but this time unannounced and not alone. He convinced 2 federal representatives who were passing through the region to accompany him, alleging serious irregularities that required immediate investigation. They were outsiders, without local connections, without the ingrained fears that paralyzed the residents of Hollow Ridge. For them, it was just another administrative task that might or might not reveal something significant. The second visit to the ranch took place on a cloudy April morning. The low fog transformed the mountains into ghostly silhouettes, and the air carried that cool dampness characteristic of spring in the Appalachians. Thornwood greeted them at his door with an expression that mixed surprise and something darker, more calculated. Brennan presented his credentials and explained that they needed to conduct a complete inspection of the property, including all buildings and wooded areas. It wasn't a request. It was an official notification that carried the weight of federal authority. The farmer tried to argue, invoking property rights, privacy, claiming he had done nothing illegal. But the deputies were inflexible. They had authorization to conduct the inspection with or without his cooperation. Thornwood realized he had no choice. Something changed in his eyes at that moment, a cold resignation that Brennan interpreted as acceptance of the inevitable. The farmer grabbed a coat and said he would accompany them, but that they would regret their intrusion. It was a strange phrase, laden with multiple possible meanings. The inspection began with the main barns and sheds. Everything seemed normal at first glance. Farm tools, sacks of grain, equipment in various states of repair. But as they moved toward the more distant buildings, those on the edges of the property, the atmosphere changed. There was one shed that Thornwood insisted was empty, only used for occasional storage. When the deputies forced open the locked door, they found something different. The interior was divided into strange compartments, small enclosed spaces with no obvious function. The walls had marks, deep scratches in the wood, as if something or someone had tried to get out. There were chains attached to beams, metal devices whose purpose was disturbingly ambiguous. Brennan felt his stomach clench as he observed those compartments. He asked Thornwood directly what the purpose of that structure was. The farmer remained silent for long seconds before offering an explanation that sounded rehearsed and empty. He said he used those spaces to store sick animals, to isolate them from the rest of the livestock. The chains were used to restrain particularly aggressive pigs during veterinary treatments. The marks on the walls were the result of the natural behavior of confined animals. Everything had a rational explanation, according to him, although his voice carried a tension that contradicted the naturalness he was trying to project. The deputies exchanged glances. They were experienced enough to recognize when something didn't add up, but they also knew that suspicions didn't constitute evidence. There was nothing in that shed that could be defined as unequivocally illegal. Disturbing, yes. Strange, certainly, but not necessarily criminal. Brennan insisted on continuing the inspection, especially towards the wooded area that Thornwood had previously prohibited. The rancher tried one last time to dissuade them, talking about the difficult terrain, about how easy it would be to get lost among the dense trees, but the men were already determined. The forest surrounding the northern portion of the property was ancient and dense. Giant trees blocked most of the sunlight, creating a permanent twilight even in the middle of the day. The ground was covered in thick layers of dead leaves accumulated over decades, perhaps centuries. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by human presence, preserved in a pristine state. But as they advanced, Brennan began to notice subtle signs of activity, marks on trees, as if they were landmarks, almost imperceptible trails that snaked through the vegetation, and then, after about half an hour's walk, they found the first hidden structure. It was a small structure, half buried in the ground and covered by vegetation that had grown over it over the years, a cabin or shelter that would have been easily overlooked by anyone not specifically looking for something like it. The door was locked with a rusty padlock. Thornwood, following the group a few meters away, watched in absolute silence. One of the deputies broke the padlock with a tool he carried. The door opened with a groan of damp wood and rusty hinges. The interior was dark and cold, with that smell of earth and decay that characterizes places that have been closed for a long time. There were boxes stacked against the walls, covered with waterproof tarpaulin. Brennan opened one and found personal belongings, clothes, documents, small items that had clearly belonged to different people, pocket watches, worn leather wallets, faded photographs of unfamiliar faces. It was like a collection of interrupted lives, physical memories of people who were no longer there to claim them. Each box contained items from different individuals, organized with a disturbing meticulousness. Thornwood finally spoke, his voice strangely calm considering the situation. He explained that these were belongings of workers who had left the farm over the years without claiming their personal items. He had kept them, hoping they would eventually return or send some form of contact to retrieve them. It was an act of preservation, according to him, not concealment, but the quantity was unsettling. There were dozens of sets of belongings, representing dozens of people who simply left, abandoning everything behind. Brennan knew that poor people, temporary workers, didn't easily abandon their few possessions. A watch might be the only family heirloom someone had. Photographs were irreplaceable treasures. No one would leave all that behind voluntarily. The exploration continued deeper into the forest. They found other similar structures, each containing more evidence of the same nature. And then they came across something different, an artificial clearing, where trees had been deliberately removed at some point in the past. In the center of this clearing was a depression in the ground, as if something large had been buried, and then the earth had settled over time. One of the deputies, driven by investigative instinct, began to dig with a shovel they had brought. He didn't have to go very deep before encountering resistance.
Vibe Coding 101 Part 3. Stop typing your prompts. Seriously, you're prompting cursor over 100 times a day, but typing detailed context takes forever. So you send lazy prompts and you get mediocre results. I've been there and it's not fun. Let me show you how I changed my entire dev workflow.
Wood, a buried structure. It took hours of hard work to uncover what lay beneath the earth. It was a kind of underground chamber, constructed of thick planks and reinforced with beams. The entrance was sealed, but not as carefully as the other structures. When they finally managed to open it, it revealed a space that appeared to have been used as a storage room or warehouse, but for what purpose? The interior walls showed signs of prolonged use, stains suggesting dampness and time. There were hooks fixed to the beams, empty containers stacked in a corner, tools whose purpose was not immediately obvious. Thornwood, who had remained silent during the excavation, finally reacted. He tried to move away, taking a few steps towards the forest, as if intending to flee. The deputies immediately stopped him, holding him firmly as he began to speak rapidly, almost incoherently. He said they wouldn't understand, that there were reasons for everything, that he had only done what was necessary. His words were fragmented, jumping from one subject to another without clear connection. He mentioned needs that had to be met, experiments that required specific materials, knowledge he had acquired through studies that most would consider forbidden. The deputies led Thornwood back to the main house, while Brennan remained in the woods, meticulously documenting each discovery. He took photographs, made detailed drawings in his notebooks, and collected samples of materials found in the underground structures. He knew he would need solid evidence to build a case that could withstand legal scrutiny. But the more he explored, the more he realized he was facing something that defied conventional explanation. It wasn't just the number of hidden structures or the nature of the objects found. It was the palpable feeling that this place had witnessed events that left a mark on the very earth. Upon returning to Thornwood's house late in the afternoon, Brennan found the deputies searching the main rooms. They had discovered an impressive library, impressive by the standards of an isolated farmhouse. Hundreds of volumes lined up on dark wood shelves. But these were no ordinary books on agriculture or popular literature. They were ancient texts on obsolete medical practices, philosophical treatises on the nature of human consciousness, and procedural manuals that had been abandoned by modern science as unethical or ineffective. There were also personal notebooks, where Thornwood recorded detailed observations on behavior, physical reactions, and limits of endurance under various conditions. The writings revealed a mind obsessed with understanding obscure aspects of human existence. Thornwood described experiments he conducted, not with apparent malice, but with a clinical curiosity that was perhaps even more disturbing. He saw himself as a scholar, someone willing to explore territories that others considered morally forbidden in the name of higher knowledge. He believed that social conventions and ethical boundaries were artificial obstacles that prevented true understanding. In his notes, he justified his actions by arguing that individuals without strong family ties, itinerant workers without roots, were resources wasted by society that he could use for higher purposes. The coldness with which he described these ideas was shocking. There was no emotion in the texts, no acknowledgement of the suffering his actions had caused. It was like reading the diaries of someone who had completely distanced themselves from basic humanity, who had reduced people to mere objects of study. Brennan felt a growing nausea as he leafed through those notebooks. He realized he was dealing not with an ordinary criminal driven by anger or greed, but with someone who had constructed an entire philosophy to justify unimaginable acts. Among the papers, they found correspondence that revealed surprising connections. Thornwood maintained contact with other people who shared his macabre interests. There were letters from renegade doctors, from researchers who had been expelled from universities for unethical conduct, from individuals who operated on the shadowy fringes of society. They exchanged information, discussed theories, shared discoveries. It was an underground network of people who had chosen to abandon all moral boundaries in pursuit of knowledge they considered to be beyond the reach of conventional science. One of the letters was particularly revealing. Dated 1916, it came from someone who identified himself only as Dr. Silas, residing somewhere in Louisiana. He praised Thornwood for his courage in pursuing work that others would consider taboo, and mentioned his own investigations in similar areas. He said he would soon visit Hollow Ridge to personally observe the facilities Thornwood had built. The letter suggested that this visit did indeed occur, as there was a reply from Thornwood months later, thanking him for the advice received and describing improvements he had implemented based on the visitor's suggestions. The deputies also found a detailed map of the property, far more complete than any official record. It marked all the hidden structures in the forest, with notes on the purpose of each. There were strange symbols next to some locations, codes that Brennan couldn't immediately decipher. The map revealed that they had only discovered a fraction of what existed on those lands. There were at least 6 other buried or camouflaged structures that had not yet been located. It was decided that Thornwood would be taken into custody immediately, while a larger team would be organized to conduct a thorough search of the property. One of the deputies rode off on horseback to fetch reinforcements, while the other remained guarding the prisoner. Brennan took advantage of the remaining daylight hours to explore another area indicated on the map. He followed alone along a trail that led to a deep ravine covered in dense vegetation. There he found another underground chamber, this one even more elaborate than the previous ones. The entrance was disguised under a layer of stones and branches, arranged to resemble a natural accumulation of debris. But upon removing this covering, a wooden door reinforced with metal was revealed. Brennan forced his way in and descended steps of compacted earth into a large room, excavated directly into the rocky ground. The walls were supported by wooden structures, and the ceiling was low enough that he needed to slightly bend his head. Oil lamps hung from hooks, still containing fuel, suggesting that the place had been used recently. What he found inside was simultaneously fascinating and horrifying, a sort of makeshift laboratory with equipment that seemed to have been adapted from medical and industrial sources. Workbenches with tools arranged with obsessive precision, containers holding preserved liquids whose contents Brennan preferred not to examine too closely, detailed records stacked on shelves, each labeled with dates and reference numbers. It was evident that Thornwood had dedicated years to building that secret space, perfecting its facilities, expanding its capabilities. Brennan collected some of the records and began reading them by the light of his own flashlight. The texts described procedures carried out over more than a decade. Thornwood meticulously documented everything, noting variables, results, and conclusions. There were tables comparing different approaches, graphs showing progressions over time, and observations about factors influencing the outcomes of his experiments. It was like reading the research of a dedicated scientist, except that the subjects of study were people, and the methods were utterly reprehensible by any ethical standard. When Brennan emerged from that underground chamber, night had already fallen completely over Hollow Ridge. The stars shone with peculiar intensity on the mountains, unpolluted by the artificial light that was beginning to transform the larger cities. He walked back to the main house carrying a box of documents he considered essential to the investigation. His thoughts revolved around a central question. How had something like this remained hidden for so long? How could an entire community suspect, fear, but never act decisively against what was happening on those lands? The answer, he was beginning to realize, lay in the very nature of the victims Thornwood chose. Temporary workers without families, people moving from place to place seeking seasonal work, individuals who had severed ties with their communities of origin. These were people whose absence would not generate organized searches, whose disappearance would be attributed simply to their itinerant lifestyle. Thornwood had been calculating in his selection, choosing only those whose disappearance would go unnoticed or be easily explained. And when occasionally someone with stronger connections disappeared, there was a system of record erasure to obscure evidence. But who had helped Thornwood manipulate the official files? This question haunted Brennan as he mentally processed everything he had discovered. The rancher couldn't have done it alone. He would have needed accomplices within local institutions, people willing to turn a blind eye or actively participate in the cover-up, and he would have needed powerful motivation to secure their cooperation. Money, probably. Thornwood had significant financial resources whose origin had never been adequately explained. But perhaps there were also threats, intimidation, the kind of silent pressure that small communities know well. Back at the house, he found the deputy keeping Thornwood under surveillance in the main room. The prisoner was seated in a chair, his hands bound, but his posture remained strangely relaxed. When Brennan entered, Thornwood looked up and spoke for the first time in hours. He said the investigator was making a fundamental mistake in judging his actions by common standards of morality. He argued that history was full of examples of people who were condemned in their time, but later recognized as visionaries. That knowledge always required sacrifices, and that future generations would understand the value of what he had tried to achieve. It was a speech that revealed the depth of Thornwood's mental distortion. He genuinely believed he was contributing to something greater, that his actions would eventually be validated by scientific progress. He showed no remorse, only frustration at having been interrupted before completing what he considered his work. Brennan listened in silence, recognizing that he was facing someone completely detached from basic human empathy. There was no rational argument that could penetrate this barrier of self-justification that Thornwood had built around himself. The night dragged on slowly. The deputy who had left to seek reinforcements would not return until the following morning, so all that remained was to wait. Brennan used the time to examine more closely the documents he had collected. Among them, he found something that changed his understanding of the whole situation. It was an old letter, dated 1904, addressed to Thornwood from someone who signed only as mentor. The text was cryptic but revealing, speaking of the importance of choosing the right location to establish a place of study, of the need for isolation and discretion, of methods to ensure that neighbors remained ignorant or complacent. The letter suggested that Thornwood had not conceived his activities independently. He had been instructed, trained, and prepared by another person who possessed similar experience. And even more disturbing, The letter implied that there were others like him established in different remote regions, all conducting their own macabre investigations under the cloak of geographical isolation. It was a larger network than Brennan had imagined, an invisible community of individuals united by interests that civilized society utterly rejected. This discovery transformed the case from an investigation into an individual criminal into something potentially much broader. If Thornwood was part of an organized network, then his capture could lead to other revelations, other places that would need to be investigated. But it also meant danger. People with resources and influence might try to protect their interests, silence witnesses, destroy evidence. Brennan realized he would need to be extremely careful about how to proceed, about whom to share information with, about whom he could trust within the official structures. At dawn, the sound of horses announced the arrival of reinforcements. The deputy returned accompanied by Sheriff Hargrove and 4 additional men. Hargrove seemed visibly shaken, as if part of him had hoped the suspicions would never be confirmed. He looked at Thornwood with an expression that mixed anger and something close to sadness. Perhaps he regretted not having acted years before, when Martin Dalton had come to him with disturbing reports. Perhaps he carried guilt for the lives that could have been saved if he had had the courage to investigate properly. The expanded team began a systematic search of the entire property, using the map they found as a guide. Over the following days, they discovered each of the marked hidden structures, as well as others that weren't even documented. Each discovery added layers to their understanding of what Thornwood had built there. It wasn't just a random collection of hiding places, but a carefully planned and executed complex spanning more than a decade. There was a logic to the arrangement of the structures, an organization that reflected a specific purpose for each one. Among the most disturbing discoveries was a structure that appeared to have been used as an archive. It contained meticulous records not only of Thornwood's own activities, but also correspondence with other members of his network. Names, locations, descriptions of similar work being conducted in places as far apart as the Oregon mountains and the Florida swamps. The extent of the network was shocking. Brennan realized he was holding evidence of a conspiracy that stretched across the country, operating in the shadows indefinitely. But there was a growing problem. As the findings piled up and the magnitude of the case became clear, Brennan began to notice subtle resistance from some local authorities, suggestions that perhaps it would be better to keep certain information confidential, that excessive publicity could harm the region, that some evidence was too ambiguous to be useful. He recognized the signs of an attempt at containment, to limit the scope of the investigation before it reached people or institutions who would prefer to remain hidden. Brennan made a crucial decision at that moment. Before any interference could compromise the evidence, he began making copies of everything he considered essential. He worked late into the night by lamplight, transcribing documents by hand, copying maps, recording every detail in his own notebooks. He sent encrypted correspondence to trusted contacts in other regions, people outside his local sphere of influence, who could preserve information should something happen to him. It was a precaution that might seem paranoid, but subsequent events would prove its wisdom. Thornwood was formally arrested and would await trial in the county jail. But his demeanor remained disconcertingly calm. He seemed convinced that somehow the legal process wouldn't truly catch up with him. When questioned about this confidence, he merely smiled enigmatically and said that there were preparations he had made, contingencies that would come into play when necessary. Brennan interpreted this as a reference to his network of associates, people with a vested interest in protecting one of their own to avoid exposure of the larger operation. And indeed, strange things began to happen. Documents that Brennan had left in the custody of the police station disappeared overnight, despite locked doors and supposedly constant surveillance. A mysterious fire destroyed part of the barn, where physical evidence was being temporarily stored. Witnesses who had agreed to give statements suddenly changed their minds, some leaving the area without prior notice. It was evident that unseen forces were actively working to sabotage the investigation. Sheriff Hargrove, to his credit, fought against this interference. He had finally found the courage to confront the fears that had paralyzed him for years, and he was determined to see justice done. But he was just a man in a vulnerable position, dependent on compromised local structures. One night he sought out Brennan privately and admitted that he was receiving pressure from prominent figures in the region. Influential businessmen, landowners, even a member of the state government had made contact suggesting that it would be better for everyone if the case were resolved discreetly, without much publicity or in-depth investigation. Brennan realized he couldn't rely solely on local authorities. He used his federal position to request direct support from superiors in Washington. He sent detailed reports, including copies of the most significant evidence, requesting intervention from higher levels of government. But the response was disappointingly slow and bureaucratic. There were procedures to follow, jurisdictions to respect, political sensitivities to consider. The machinery of the federal government, so powerful in theory, proved cumbersome and hesitant when confronted with something that challenged established categories. Meanwhile, the Hollow Ridge community reacted in complex and contradictory ways. Some residents expressed shock and horror upon learning of the extent of Thornwood's activities, swearing they never suspected anything so serious. Others admitted they always knew something was wrong, but had no idea how to proceed or who to turn to. There were also those who advocated a distorted form of local loyalty, arguing that regional problems should be solved by the region itself, without outside interference. This last faction was small but vocal, creating an atmosphere of tension that made the investigative work even more difficult. One of the most revealing moments came when Brennan decided to track down some of the workers who had left the Thornwood farm years before, and, contrary to grim assumptions, were still alive and residing elsewhere. He located 3 of them through employment records and correspondence. He traveled personally to interview them, hoping they could provide first-hand accounts of what they had witnessed or experienced during their time at Hollow Ridge. The conversations were simultaneously enlightening and frustrating. The 3 men confirmed that something was deeply wrong on the farm. They spoke of the oppressive atmosphere, the nighttime sounds emanating from off-limits areas, and the constant feeling of being watched. One of them mentioned seeing, through a partially open window of one of the sheds, equipment that looked like medical or surgical equipment, completely out of place on a rural farm. Another described an incident in which he witnessed Thornwood conversing with a well-dressed visitor who arrived in an elegant carriage, discussing progress and results in hushed tones in a way that suggested collaboration on some secret project. But when pressed to testify formally, the 3 hesitated. They had families now, lives established in new places, and the prospect of becoming involved in a complex and potentially dangerous legal case terrified them. One of them frankly admitted that he feared retaliation, that he believed Thornwood had powerful connections that could reach him even hundreds of miles away. This reluctance to testify formally significantly weakened the case Brennan was trying to build. Physical evidence was important, but direct testimony from people who had been there would have a much greater impact on any trial. The situation reached a critical point when Thornwood, who was being held awaiting trial, suddenly became seriously ill. County doctors diagnosed a condition requiring specialized treatment unavailable in the small local jail. He was transferred to a hospital in a larger city, under guard, but with access to better medical care. Brennan immediately suspected this was part of a plan, a maneuver to create opportunities for escape or further interference. His suspicions would be confirmed in a way he could not have foreseen. During Thornwood's second night in the hospital, an unexplained mix-up occurred. Guards who were supposed to be watching his room were temporarily called away to deal with a disturbance on another floor of the building. When they returned, they found the bed empty and a window open. Thornwood had vanished, and despite extensive searches in the following days, no trace of him was found. It was as if he had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the evidence of his actions and the unanswered questions that would haunt the region for decades. Brennan was devastated by the escape. All the work, all the risk, all the fighting against interference, and in the end, the main person responsible had escaped. He pressed for an investigation into the escape, convinced that it had been intentionally facilitated, and indeed inconsistencies in the guards' accounts, the convenient timing of the disturbance that distracted them, the ease with which Thornwood apparently left the hospital, everything suggested careful coordination. But proving it was another matter, especially when the people involved were protected by layers of bureaucracy and influence. The months that followed Thornwood's escape were marked by growing frustration and a sense of injustice that weighed on everyone involved in the investigation. Brennan refused to accept the disappearance as the end of the story. He dedicated every available moment to tracking down possible whereabouts of the fugitive farmer, following leads that took him across several states. There were unconfirmed reports of a man matching Thornwood's description being seen in a small town in Kentucky, then in a remote village in Tennessee, always in isolated places, where it would be easy to go unnoticed among communities that asked few questions about the past of newcomers. Each time Brennan arrived at one of these places, he found only cold traces and vague memories. People who thought they had seen someone similar but weren't sure. Boarding house owners who remembered a solitary guest who paid in cash and left without warning. It was like chasing a shadow that always moved one step ahead, always out of reach. The investigator began to suspect that Thornwood was receiving active help from his network of associates, that there was an established system to protect and relocate members when they became the target of unwanted legal attention. Meanwhile, in Hollow Ridge, Thornwood's property remained in a strange state of limbo. Legally, it belonged to him, but as a wanted fugitive, he could not claim it. Local authorities established a temporary guard over the land, but maintenance was minimal. The structures began to deteriorate under the weight of time and neglect. The main house, once well maintained despite its austere appearance, began to show signs of abandonment. Windows broken by the wind, tiles torn off by storms, vegetation beginning to reclaim spaces that had been kept clean for years. The forest, with all its hidden structures, had reverted to its natural state of impenetrability. Fallen trees blocked trails. Vegetation grew over the entrances to the underground chambers. And gradually the place became even more difficult to navigate than before. There was a feeling among the locals that the land itself rejected human interference, as if it wanted to bury the secrets it had witnessed. Few dared approach the property, and those who did reported an atmosphere of unease that made them hasten their departure. Brennan, in his ongoing investigations, made a discovery that shed new light on the entire situation. Through contacts in academic institutions, he gained access to files on researchers who had been expelled or marginalized by the scientific community in recent decades. Among these records, he found references to an informal group that called themselves seekers of transcendental knowledge, individuals who believed that conventional science was limited by unnecessary moral scruples. They corresponded, published occasionally in obscure journals, and apparently met at irregular intervals to share their findings. Thornwood's name appeared in those records, but so did dozens of others. Doctors who had lost their licenses for questionable conduct, academic researchers whose study proposals had been rejected by ethics committees, independent individuals with sufficient financial resources to establish private laboratories where they didn't have to answer to any institutional authority. It was an entire subculture operating on the fringes of respectable society, united by a shared rejection of ethical boundaries that the rest of humanity considered fundamental. One of the figures who appeared repeatedly in these correspondences was the mysterious Dr. Silas mentioned in the letters found on the Thornwood property. Brennan was able to trace his true identity through cross-referencing in multiple documents. He was a former professor of medicine who had taught at a university in the South until he was forced to resign after accusations about the nature of his experiments. He had settled on an isolated plantation in Louisiana, where he continued his research away from critical eyes. The investigator considered traveling there to confront Silas, but his superiors advised against it. Without clear jurisdiction, and without direct evidence linking Silas to specific crimes, such action could result in legal complications. Furthermore, there was the risk of alerting the entire network to how extensive the authorities' knowledge of their operations had become. It was a frustrating strategic decision, choosing between immediate action and calculated patience. But Brennan reluctantly agreed to wait until a stronger case could be built. Back in Hollow Ridge, something unexpected happened. One of the workers Brennan had interviewed earlier, the one who had witnessed unusual medical equipment on the farm, changed his mind about testifying. He wrote a letter to the investigator, explaining that his conscience no longer allowed him to remain silent, that his nights had been tormented by thoughts of others who may have suffered a worse fate than his. He was willing to give formal testimony, regardless of the personal risks. This was the first major breach in the wall of silence that had protected Thornwood's activities for so long. Brennan arranged for the testimony to be officially recorded, with multiple copies made and distributed to different authorities as a precaution against loss or destruction. The man, whose name was recorded in the documents as Thomas Whitley, provided a detailed account of his 4 months working on the farm during the summer of 1915. He described the daily routine, the areas he was allowed access to, and crucially, the moments when he had witnessed things that did not fit the narrative of a normal agricultural operation. Whitley spoke of nights when he heard the sounds of carriages arriving long after nightfall, of conversations floating through open windows in which Thornwood discussed matters completely unrelated to agriculture. He mentioned a specific incident in which, waking in the middle of the night from thirst, he left the workers' quarters and saw lights moving towards the forest. He followed at a distance, curious, and observed Thornwood and two other men he didn't recognize entering one of the hidden structures. They were carrying boxes and equipment, working silently with the efficiency of those performing a familiar task. The testimony also included descriptions of changes in the behavior of other workers. One man who had been cheerful and sociable became withdrawn and nervous after being assigned to work on a specific part of the property. Another simply disappeared one night, with Thornwood explaining the following morning that he had decided to leave suddenly, although he had left behind all his possessions. Including weeks' worth of work savings, Whitley said that at the time he accepted these explanations because he had no reason to question them, but in retrospect, the patterns were clearly suspicious. With this testimony in hand, Brennan again tried to press for a broader investigation of the network Thornwood was part of. He argued that focusing only on the fugitive farmer was ignoring a much larger systemic problem. There were others conducting similar activities, protected by the same mechanisms of isolation and influence that had allowed Thornwood to operate for so long. But the response from higher authorities was lukewarm. They acknowledged the problem, but cited resource limitations, jurisdictional complexities, and the difficulty of building cases against individuals operating on remote private properties. The truth, which Brennan was beginning to realize with painful clarity, was that the system was not equipped, or perhaps not sufficiently motivated, to deal with this type of crime. Crimes that occurred in the shadows, against marginalized victims, in places that most people preferred to ignore, simply did not receive the necessary attention and resources. There was an institutional inertia that favored leaving certain things buried, not necessarily out of malice, but out of convenience and the human tendency to avoid confronting uncomfortable realities. Frustrated but not defeated, Brennan made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He would begin to comprehensively document everything he had learned, creating a record that could serve future investigations even if the current one did not reach satisfactory conclusions. He spent entire nights organizing evidence, connecting dots between different cases and individuals, building a map of the network that was both literal and metaphorical. It was a job he knew he might not complete in his lifetime, but one that could provide a foundation for others to continue. The following years brought silent changes to Hollow Ridge. The abandoned property on the hill became part of the landscape in a different way, no longer as someone's home, but as a place that existed on the fringes of collective memory. Structures began to crumble under the weight of time, wood rotting, roofs collapsing, walls leaning at gravity-defying angles before finally surrendering completely. Nature, patient and relentless, reclaimed every inch the farmer had once mastered. Brennan continued his work for a few more years, but the intensity of the search eventually diminished, not through giving up, but through the gradual acceptance that some stories don't have satisfactory conclusions. Some questions remain suspended in the air like mountain mist, visible but intangible, present but impossible to grasp. He kept his files organized, updating them when occasional information reached him. But the initial obsession gave way to a quieter, more sustainable determination over time. There were times over the years when rumors would arrive from faraway places. A traveler would swear he'd seen a man matching Thornwood's description at a remote train station. A merchant would mention a solitary customer who spoke little and always paid in old coins. But each time these threads were pulled, they unraveled into inconsistencies and uncertain memories. It was like trying to catch smoke with your hands, always dispersing the moment you thought you had something solid. The community of Hollow Ridge learned to live with the shadows of its past, the way small communities do, not through direct confrontation or complete processing, but through gradual and silent acceptance. People stopped talking openly about the farmer on the hill, but that didn't mean forgetting. It was more like keeping something painful in a safe place within themselves, acknowledging its existence without letting it completely dominate the present. Life went on because it needed to go on, with its harvests and its seasons, its births and its natural farewells. Sheriff Hargrove carried the weight of his past hesitations until his final days. There were nights when he sat alone, gazing toward the mountains, pondering the decisions he had made and those he had avoided making. He wondered if more decisive action years earlier would have changed anything, if lives could have been different. These are questions that have no true answers, only endless speculations that circulate in endless patterns. He never spoke publicly about these thoughts, but those close to him recognized the change, the silent weight he carried. The structures in the forest, those underground chambers and hidden constructions, gradually became part of the stories people told. But with each retelling, with each passing generation, the details changed. What was terrifying became mysterious. What was specific became vague. What was real blended with the imagined. This is how collective memories work, especially regarding events that people prefer not to examine too closely. The truth remains buried under layers of reinterpretation until what remains is more legend than history. Thornwood, wherever he was, became less a person and more an idea. He represented something about the dark places that exist not only geographically, but within human existence itself. Those spaces where choices are made away from witnesses, where boundaries can be transgressed without immediate consequences, where distance from organized society creates a dangerous freedom for those inclined to exploit it. He was an example, perhaps unique in his specific details, but representative of a broader phenomenon that existed on the margins. Brennan, in his final years of service before eventually retiring, began to see the Hollow Ridge case not as a personal failing, but as a lesson about the limitations of human systems. No matter how well structured the laws, how dedicated the institutions, there will always be loopholes. There will always be places that fall outside the network of protection and surveillance, not due to a deliberate design flaw, but simply the impossibility of being everywhere at once, of seeing everything, of completely protecting against those determined to operate in the shadows. He shared his files with successors, hoping they could serve future investigations, or at least as a record of what had been discovered and what remained unknown. Some of these younger investigators showed interest, followed some leads for a while, but eventually they too were pulled into other cases, other urgencies. The network Thornwood was part of, if it truly existed to the extent the evidence suggested, proved too resilient, too dispersed, protected by enough layers of secrecy and influence to withstand full exposure. The property itself remained empty for decades. Occasionally someone would suggest it should be sold, that the land could be used for productive purposes. But there was always hesitation, an unexplained reluctance to take possession of something so marked by dark events. It was as if the place itself carried a reputation that made it untouchable, not by law but by tacit collective agreement. And so it remained, slowly returning to the forest, being absorbed into the landscape until one day perhaps there would no longer be a distinction between what was built by humans and what has always been nature. The stories persisted in fragmented forms. Occasional visitors to the region, perhaps historians interested in local peculiarities, or simply curious individuals drawn by rumors, would ask questions. The older residents shared what they knew or what they chose to share, always with the hesitation that comes from speaking about things they would rather forget. Younger generations knew only diluted versions, stories that had lost their original clarity and gained elements that made them more palatable or simply more interesting to tell. Ultimately, what Hollow Ridge represents is a reflection on the spaces between knowledge and mystery, between what can be proven and what can only be suspected. It's a reminder that not all stories resolve themselves in clear and satisfying endings. Some remain open, with loose ends that will never be tied up, with questions that will not find complete answers. And perhaps there is value in that too, in recognizing that uncertainty is part of the human experience, that not everything can or should be completely understood. The mist still descends upon those mountains as it always has, indifferent to the human dramas that unfolded beneath its temporary blanket. Trees grow and fall in their natural cycles. Streams flow through ravines, eroding stone with eternal patience. And somewhere in this landscape that continues its existence independent of human stories, vestiges of what once was remain, no longer accessible, no longer relevant to daily life, but still existing, preserved by time and distance. If this journey through the shadows of Hollow Ridge touched you, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment, and if you enjoyed it, a like helps me continue bringing you these stories. Until next time.